The air on the island of Leyte in December 1944 did not just feel hot, it felt heavy enough to crush a man, lungs inside his chest. It was a suffocating blanket of humidity, trapped under a triple canopy of rotting jungle vegetation, where the smell of wet decay mixed with the sharp metallic tang of cordite and the sickly sweet stench of unburied dead. For the men of the 126th Infantry Regiment of the 32nd Infantry Division, this place had ceased to be a geographical location on a map of the Philippines and had transformed into a green and brown purgatory of mud and blood. They called this sector the Ormoc Corridor, but to the men shivering in their foxholes filled with lukewarm rainwater, it was simply the end of the world. The ground was a slurry of volcanic soil and human waste that sucked at boots and swallowed equipment whole. Every breath tasted of fungus and mold. The rain did not fall in drops. It fell in sheets hammering against steel helmets with a rhythmic madness that made sleep impossible and kept nerves stretched so tight they vibrated with every snap of a twig. In this environment, the machinery of war rusted overnight and the skin of soldiers rotted right off their feet. This was the backdrop for a collision that would defy the laws of probability and rewrite the doctrine of infantry versus armor warfare. Private First Class Dirk J. Vlug was tired beyond the capacity of language to describe. He was a man whittled down by weeks of combat. His uniform, a second skin of grime and dried sweat, his eyes sunken into dark hollows that had seen too much and slept too little. He was part of a roadblock detachments tasked with holding a section of Highway 2, a narrow ribbon of crushed rock and mud that snaked through the mountains and served as the jugular vein for the Japanese forces trying to reinforce their crumbling positions. Vlug was not a chaotic man, he was a soldier of the United States Army, and he understood the geometry of the battlefield. He knew that to hold the road meant to stop the flow of supplies, and stopping the flow meant killing anything that moved. But on this particular morning, the jungle had gone quiet in a way that raised the hackles on the back of his neck. It was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of a predator holding its breath before the strike. He stood near the edge of the road, checking his perimeter, his hands moving with the unconscious competence of a veteran, touching the reassuring steel of his weapons, not out of fear, but out of habit. Then the sound came. It started as a low vibration in the soles of his boots, a tremor that shook the standing water in the puddles on the road. It grew into a mechanical grinding, a rhythmic clanking of steel tracks, chewing into the earth, accompanied by the guttural roar of diesel engines straining against the incline. Infantrymen know this sound. It is the sound of death approaching in an iron box. It triggers a primal response in the human brain, a realization that flesh and bone are about to be pitted against tons of hardened steel and high explosive. Dirk Vlug did not run. He shifted his position, moving slightly out of the open, but staying close enough to the road to engage. He peered through the screen of foliage, his heart rate dropping into a steady pounding rhythm as the source of the noise rounded the bend. They appeared one by one, emerging from the morning mist, like prehistoric beasts made of riveted metal. Japanese tanks, not one or two but 5 of them moving in a column that dominated the narrow roadway. These were likely Type 95 Hago light tanks, or perhaps the slightly heavier Type 97 Chi-Ha. To the average American Sherman crew, these Japanese tanks were obsolete tin cans, barely worthy of a main gun round. But to a lone infantryman standing in the mud with nothing but his personal weapons, they were invincible fortresses. They were armed with 37mm or 57mm main guns and raking machine guns that could turn a man into a pink mist in a fraction of a second. The column rumbled forward with an arrogance that was palpable. The engines belched black smoke into the humid air, and the tracks threw up clods of mud as they claimed the road as their own. The sheer weight of the metal pressed down on the psychological state of every American soldier in the vicinity. But it was what happened next that shifted the dynamic from a military engagement to a personal vendetta. As the lead tank closed the distance, the commander hatch on the turret was thrown open. A Japanese officer emerged, his torso visible above the steel ring of the cupola. He did not look like a man expecting combat. He looked like a man on a parade ground. He scanned the road ahead, and his eyes locked onto the solitary figure of Private First Class Vlug standing near the verge. Vlug was exposed. He looked small, insignificant, and utterly doomed against the might of 5 armored vehicles. The Japanese officer saw the American soldier, and he did not button up his hatch. He did not shout a fire command. Instead, he laughed. It was a visual gesture of pure contempt. The other tank commanders followed suit, popping their hatches and leaning out to share in the joke. They saw a dirty, exhausted man with a metal tube on his shoulder and a pistol on his hip, and they saw a dead man walking. They saw a target so pathetic it was beneath the dignity of their main guns. They believed their own propaganda that the American spirit was weak, that the individual soldier would crumble before the might of the imperial armor. They believed they were the apex predators of this jungle, and that Vlug was merely prey, waiting to be crushed under their treads. This moment of mockery was the catalyst. It was a profound miscalculation of the American temperament. There is a specific kind of cold rage that settles over a soldier when he is dismissed as a threat. When the enemy looks at you and sees not a warrior, but a nuisance, it strips away the fear of death and replaces it with a burning desire to prove them wrong in the most violent way possible. Dirk Vlug watched the Japanese tankers laugh. He saw their smiles. He saw their relaxed posture. He saw the open hatches, which were essentially invitations to the grave. He did not feel fear anymore. The adrenaline that flooded his system was not the flight response. It was the high-octane fuel of combat focus. He tightened his grip on the pistol grip of his weapon. The world narrowed down to a tunnel of vision centered on the lead tank. The jungle noise faded away. The humidity vanished. There was only the target, the weapon, and the insult that demanded an answer in high explosive. To understand the magnitude of what Vlug was about to attempt, one must understand the tool he held in his hands. It was the M1A1 rocket launcher known universally to the troops as the bazooka. In 1944, this weapon was a piece of heresy in the world of ballistics. It was a simple steel tube, open at both ends, roughly 54 inches long, and weighing just over 13 pounds. It looked like a stovepipe attached to a wooden stock and a rudimentary trigger mechanism. To the uninitiated, it appeared to be a toy, a piece of plumbing hardware that had no business on a modern battlefield. It had no recoil mechanism because the rocket exhaust vented out the back. It had no complex optics, just a simple iron sight frame. It felt flimsy compared to the machine solidity of an M1 Garand rifle or a Browning automatic rifle. Yet this hollow tube represented a revolution in infantry firepower, giving a single man the ability to carry the destructive potential of a light artillery piece on his shoulder. The projectile itself was the M6A1 rocket, a 21-inch long missile, weighing about 3.5 pounds. Inside the warhead was the secret to its lethality. It utilized the Monroe effect, a phenomenon of shaped charge explosives. The explosive filler was hollowed out into a cone shape lined with copper. When the rocket struck the target, a base fuse detonated the explosive from the rear. The force of the blast collapsed the copper cone inward, focusing all the energy into a hypervelocity jet of molten metal and superheated gas. This jet moved at speeds of 25,000 feet per second, punching through solid steel armor as if it were soft butter. It did not rely on kinetic energy like a tank shell. It relied on physics and chemistry. Upon penetration, the jet would spray the interior of the tank with spalling metal and searing heat, igniting fuel lines, detonating ammunition, and instantly killing the crew. It was a gruesome, horrific way to die, and Dirk Vlug carried this power in a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. But the bazooka was a weapon that demanded a steep price from its operator. It was notoriously temperamental in the humid conditions of the Pacific. The electrical firing circuit relied on 2 dry cell batteries stored in the wooden stock. In the soaking wet jungle of Leyte batteries, corroded contacts fouled and wires shorted out. To fire the weapon, the soldier had to trust that when he pulled the trigger, the electrical charge would travel down the wire, ignite the propellant, and send the rocket flying. If it clicked and failed, the soldier was left standing in the open with a useless metal tube facing an angry tank. Furthermore, the weapon had a terrifying backblast. When fired, a cone of flame and debris erupted from the rear of the tube for 20 yards. This meant Vlug could not fire from an enclosed space or with a wall behind him. He had to be out in the open or in a carefully prepared position. The backblast also kicked up a massive cloud of dust and smoke, instantly revealing his position to every enemy gunner in the sector. To fire a bazooka was to announce your presence to the world and invite immediate retaliation. Usually, the bazooka was a crew-served weapon. The doctrine called for a gunner and a loader. The gunner aimed and fired, while the loader inserted the rockets into the rear of the tube, connected the firing wire to the contact post, and tapped the gunner on the helmet to signal ready. This 2-man team allowed for a rapid rate of fire and gave the gunner a second set of eyes. But on this mud-slicked road in Leyte, Dirk Vlug was operating alone. He was the gunner and the loader. He was the entire anti-tank squad, rolled into one exhausted, determined human being. This meant that after every shot, he would have to lower the weapon, reach back into his bag, pull out a fresh rocket, verify the safety pin was removed, load it into the rear of the tube, and fumble with the small wire connection to the contact spring, all while under fire and likely moving to avoid being killed. The physical awkwardness of this solo operation cannot be overstated. It was a juggling act performed on the edge of a razor blade. Vlug stood his ground as the laughter from the Japanese tanks drifted over the engine noise. He checked the connection on his loaded rocket one last time. He felt the weight of the tube on his shoulder, the balance of it familiar and deadly. He knew the effective range of the weapon was theoretically 300 yards, but in reality, against a moving target, he needed to be much closer. He needed to be within the zone where missing was impossible. He watched the lead tank continue its advance, the commander still visible, still smiling. The disrespect burned in Vlug's chest like a hot coal. They thought he was helpless because they measured power in tons of steel and millimeters of armor thickness. They did not understand that power on the battlefield is also measured in the willingness of a man to stand his ground and the technical proficiency to use the tools at his disposal. Vlug raised the bazooka. The iron sights settled on the lead tank. He did not aim for the thickest armor on the front slope. He aimed for the sweet spot, the chaotic junction of the turret ring, or the tracks, or the thinner side armor that would be exposed as the tank maneuvered. The atmosphere around him seemed to thicken. The rain continued to fall, running in rivulets down his face and dripping off the end of the launcher. His finger took up the slack on the trigger. He was a singular point of resistance in a collapsing line. He was the heresy of the modern age, the idea that one man with a $3 rocket could humiliate the pinnacle of industrial warfare. The Japanese commander in the lead tank likely never saw the moment Vlug decided to fire. He never saw the finger tighten. He only saw the soldier he had laughed at suddenly become a statue of concentration. And then he would have seen the puff of smoke and the streak of fire. But by then, the laughter would have died in his throat replaced by the sudden, terrible realization that the predator had become the prey. The abyss of the jungle was about to answer the insult, and the answer would be delivered at the speed of a shaped charge jet. Vlug exhaled half a breath, steadying his hands against the adrenaline tremors. He was alone. He was outnumbered 5-1 against armor, and he squeezed. The trigger mechanism completed the circuit, and the rocket motor ignited with a sound like tearing canvas. A tongue of flame lashed out from the rear of the tube, kicking up a geyser of mud and water behind Vlug. The projectile leapt forward, accelerating instantly, leaving a trail of gray smoke that connected the weapon to the target like a physical tether. At this range, the flight time was non-existent. One moment the Japanese commander was leaning out of his hatch, laughing at the muddy American, and in the next fraction of a second, the shaped charge warhead impacted the turret directly beneath him. The detonation was a sharp, cracking thunderclap that echoed off the jungle walls. The copper cone inside the warhead collapsed, focusing its hellish energy into a needle of molten metal that punched through the steel armor of the Type 95 as if it were nothing more than painted cardboard. The effect on the lead tank was catastrophic and immediate. The laughter was silenced, not by a command, but by physics. The superheated jet of gas and metal sprayed the interior of the cramped fighting compartment, instantly turning the atmosphere inside into a blast furnace. Ammunition cooked off in a sympathetic detonation that sent a pillar of fire shooting out of the open hatch, where the commander had been standing just a heartbeat before. The tank lurched violently, its tracks locking up as the driver was incinerated at his controls. The machine that had been a terrifying engine of war was instantly transformed into a burning steel coffin. The sheer violence of the kill sent a shockwave through the rest of the Japanese column. The other crews who seconds ago had been sharing in the joke now watched in horror as their leader was consumed by flames. The psychological pivot was instantaneous. The predators had just seen the mouse bite back with the force of a thunderbolt. But for Dirk Vlug, there was no time to admire his handiwork. The firing of the bazooka had marked his position with a giant arrow of smoke and fire. The backblast had cleared the vegetation behind him, and the flash had seared his location into the retinas of every surviving enemy soldier. He was now the most important target on the battlefield. He dropped to one knee, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. This was the crucible. He had to reload. In a standard two-man team, the loader would have already been shoving the next round into the breech. But Vlug was alone. He placed the hot tube on the mud, the smell of burnt propellant stinging his nose. His hands slick with rain, and sweat fumbled with the canvas bag at his side. He pulled out another rocket, the metal cold and slippery. The jungle erupted around him. The second tank in the column, recovering from the initial shock, began to traverse its turret. The machine gunner in the hull opened up, spraying the vegetation around Vlug position with a scythe of lead. Bullets snapped through the air, cracking like whips, tearing through leaves and thudding into the wet earth inches from his body. Vlug ignored it. He had to ignore it. To focus on the incoming fire was to die. He focused entirely on the mechanical task at hand. He pulled the safety pin from the rocket. He slid it into the rear of the tube, feeling the satisfying clunk as it seated. He grabbed the firing wire and wrapped it around the contact spring, his fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of the adrenaline dump. He picked up the launcher again, the heat of the barrel radiating against his cheek. He did not stay in the same spot. That was a rookie mistake. He scrambled sideways, moving through the thick undergrowth, dragging the weapon with him. The mud sucked at his knees, trying to hold him in place for the Japanese gunners. He fought the terrain as much as the enemy. He popped up 10 yards from his original position. The second tank was now frantically searching for him, its turret jerking left and right. The crew had buttoned up, slamming their hatches shut in a belated attempt to save themselves. It did not matter. Vlug leveled the weapon again. The sights hovered over the side profile of the second tank. He took a breath, held it, and fired. Again the roar, again the back blast. The rocket slammed into the hull of the second tank. The explosion cracked the armor plate, shattering the mechanical heart of the beast. The tank shuddered and died, its engine coughing into silence, smoke pouring from the engine vents. 2 down. The reality of what was happening began to dawn on the remaining 3 Japanese crews. This was not a fortified position. This was not an anti-tank gun crew. This was one man. One man who was moving through the jungle like a phantom striking with the wrath of a god. Panic began to set in. The discipline of the Imperial Army, which relied heavily on structure and command, crumbled in the face of this chaotic individual aggression. The third tank in the line, desperate to escape the kill zone, revved its engine and tried to turn. The driver slammed the stick forward, attempting to pivot the vehicle in the narrow confines of the road. It was a fatal error. By turning, the tank exposed its thinner side armor and its vulnerable tracks to Vlug gaze. Vlug was already moving again. His lungs burned. The humidity was a physical weight pressing down on him, making every movement an effort of will. He reached into his bag, 3 rockets left. He went through the ritual again. Load. Wire. Aim. The process was becoming muscle memory, a dance of death performed in the pouring rain. He saw the third tank trying to slew around its tracks, churning the mud into a soup. He aimed low. He wanted to immobilize it, to strip away its mobility and leave it helpless. He fired. The rocket streaked out and struck the drive sprocket of the turning tank. The explosion blew the track apart, unspooling it like a broken watch spring. The tank slewed violently to the side, sliding into the ditch, and coming to a halt at a useless angle, its gun pointing harmlessly into the sky. The crew of the third tank, knowing they were sitting ducks, popped their hatches and tried to bail out. They scrambled over the hull, desperate to reach the safety of the jungle. Vlug dropped the bazooka and drew his pistol. The sidearm, a standard issue. Colt 1911 was a heavy, reassuring chunk of steel. He fired methodically the heavy .45 caliber rounds, knocking the fleeing tankers off the hull of their ruined machine. It was brutal, close-quarters work. There was no chivalry here. This was the slaughterhouse of the Ormoc corridor. Vlug was not just destroying machines, he was dismantling the enemy fighting force piece by piece. He holstered the pistol and picked up the bazooka. There were still 2 tanks left. The remaining 2 tanks, trapped behind the burning wreckage of their comrades, were in a state of absolute chaos. The road was blocked. They could not move forward. They could not turn around without exposing themselves to the demon in the jungle. They were paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the situation. Vlug utilized this paralysis. He moved again, flanking the column, pushing himself deeper into the tree line to get a better angle. The thorns tore at his uniform, and the insects bit at his exposed skin, but he felt none of it. He was operating on a plane of existence, where pain did not exist, where only the mission mattered. He emerged from the brush roughly 20 yards from the 4th tank. The crew was firing blindly, their machine guns chewing up the jungle in a desperate attempt to hit their invisible tormentor. Vlug stood calmly amidst the flying vegetation. He was the eye of the storm. He raised the launcher for the 4th time. The sheer physical exhaustion of handling the weapon, of running and loading and firing, was immense. His arms shook, his vision blurred with sweat. He blinked it away. He forced his body to obey. He aligned the sights on the rear engine deck of the 4th tank, where the armor was thinnest and the fuel was stored. He fired. The rocket impacted with a dull thud, followed by a catastrophic explosion. The fuel tanks ignited. The vehicle was instantly engulfed in a ball of orange flame that defied the rain. The heat was intense enough to sear Vlug eyebrows even at this distance. The screams from inside the burning steel were short and terrible, before being swallowed by the roar of the fire. 4 tanks destroyed. 1 man. The 5th tank, the last survivor of the arrogant column that had laughed at the lone soldier, was now alone. The driver panicked. In a frantic attempt to escape the slaughter, he threw the tank into reverse. The tracks spun wildly, throwing up curtains of mud. The vehicle lurched backward, careening off the road, and sliding down a steep embankment towards the river below. It crashed through the undergrowth, rolling and tumbling, until it came to rest at the bottom, trapped in the soft mud of the riverbank. It was effectively neutralized, removed from the battle by the sheer terror Vlug had inflicted. But Vlug was not done. He was not a man to leave a job half-finished. He reloaded his final rocket. He moved to the edge of the embankment, looking down at the crippled tank. The crew was still inside, likely concussed and terrified. Vlug raised the bazooka one last time. He aimed down at the top of the turret, the weakest point on any tank. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel joy. He felt the heavy, grim satisfaction of a duty discharged. He fired. The final rocket struck the turret roof. The explosion was contained, muted by the earth and the water, but the result was final. The tank ceased to move. The engine died. The threat was ended. Silence rushed back into the jungle. It was a heavy, ringing silence that felt louder than the gunfire. The rain continued to fall hissing as it hit the red-hot armor of the burning tanks. The road, which minutes ago had been a thoroughfare of imperial arrogance, was now a graveyard of smoking metal and charred flesh. Dirk Vlug stood alone on the road. His bazooka was empty, a useless metal tube now. His uniform was shredded, covered in mud, and the grease of the weapon. His hands trembled uncontrollably, the adrenaline crash hitting him like a physical blow. He looked at the devastation he had wrought. 5 tanks. A localized apocalypse delivered by one man who refused to be mocked. He walked slowly among the wreckage. The heat from the burning tanks pushed back the chill of the rain. The smell was overpowering, a mix of diesel roasting meat and wet earth. He checked the bodies not for loot, but for intelligence and to ensure no one was playing dead. He was the ghost of the battlefield, a specter moving through the ruin he had created. Other American soldiers from his unit began to emerge from their positions further down the road. They approached slowly, their weapons, lowered their eyes wide with disbelief. They looked at the burning tanks. They looked at Vlug. They looked back at the tanks. The math did not make sense to them. Infantrymen did not kill 5 tanks. It was a statistical impossibility. "Vlug," one of them asked, his voice cracking. Did you do all this?" Dirk Vlug looked at his squad mate. He wiped a mixture of soot and rain from his face. He didn't have a speech prepared. He didn't have a heroic line. He just nodded slowly. "They laughed," he said simply. "They shouldn't have laughed." The story of what happened on the Ormoc Road rippled through the Pacific Theater. It was the kind of story that soldiers told in hushed tones in the mess halls and the foxholes. It became a legend that grew with every telling, but the core truth remained undeniable. One man had stood against 5 tanks and won. It was a validation of the American spirit, of the idea that the individual soldier, when pushed to the brink, is capable of impossible things. On June 26, 1946, inside the White House, President Harry S. Truman stood before Master Sergeant Dirk J. Vlug. The war was over. The jungle of Leyte was a world away. Vlug wore a clean uniform, his shoes polished, his face shaven. But behind his eyes, the shadow of the Ormoc Road still lingered. Truman read the citation for the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration the United States can bestow. He spoke of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, of disregarding his own safety, of the destruction of 5 enemy tanks. The words were formal, dignified, and heavy with the weight of gratitude. Truman placed the blue ribbon around Vlug's neck. The medal rested heavy on his chest. It was a star of gold, surrounded by a laurel wreath. It was a symbol of the nation thanks. But as Vlug stood there, the flashbulbs popping and the politicians clapping, he likely did not see the clean walls of the White House. He likely saw the rain and the mud. He likely smelled the cordite and the burning diesel. He likely heard the grinding of tracks and the laughter of a man who thought he was safe inside his steel shell. Dirk Vlug lived a long life after the war. He served his country, he raised a family, he grew old. But he remained defined by those few minutes on a muddy road in the Philippines. He was the embodiment of the lesson that history has taught time and time again, but which tyrants and bullies never seem to learn. You can have the biggest tanks. You can have the thickest armor. You can have the numbers and the noise and the arrogance. But if you push a free man into a corner, if you insult his dignity and threaten his life, you had better be prepared for the consequences. Because sometimes that man will push back. And sometimes, like Dirk Vlug, he will burn your world to the ground.